Alright, so today we're talking about in-flight emergencies. I created this scenario based kind of off of the plane that I'm flying and the airports that I fly between. Hopefully no one ever has to experience any of these, but in today's emergency, I talk about an electrical fire, and it happened in a Cherokee, the Piper PA-28. It's between a student and an instructor, and they end up going from Savannah to Ridgeland Airport and doing their emergency landing there. So, the cause of the fire. So, the fire is an electrical fire. It was thought to be caused by insulation issues. It wasn't exactly known, and one of these issues was when it's arcing, so whenever the wires rub against each other and chafe, they wear away on that insulation, causing the wires to touch each other and burst into flames, basically. So, let's see. Alright, now one of the first things that we learn as new pilots in emergency situations is the phrase aviate, navigate, communicate. That's definitely one of the most important things that I think you can understand in emergencies. You want to fly the plane first, you want to navigate second, and then communicate third. So communicate being with ATC or anyone outside that you can call and let them know about the emergency. So that would be basically the last step that you would take. You want, like the picture says, keep calm and aviate. So we always want to make sure we're in control of the plane, figure out where you are, where you're going, and then lastly talk to ATC or communicate to somebody else. So the instructor here, she notices the fire because of the insulin smell. Electrical fires create a very acrid, strong smell. It smells like insulin, so they're pretty easy to detect. And the white smoke that comes out of the plane. So she noticed that, and that's how they knew a fire was happening. She checked for power on all the controls. One of the circuit breakers had popped, so that's definitely a sign too that there was a fire. The power was there, but they were starting to shut down, which usually indicates that the fire is growing. So this was not exactly the best situation for them. Every plane should have an emergency checklist too. So that was the next step for the student and the instructor, was moving on to that checklist. Once they noticed the fire, acknowledged it and realized exactly what it was, not just any fire, an electrical fire, then they had to move on to going through that checklist, that emergency checklist. So next step is the checklist, and here's an example of a checklist that they had, which it's the emergency procedure checklist. So obviously this one was an electrical fire. Thankfully there were two of them, so they were able to do the aviate, navigate, communicate scenario. The instructor was aviating the plane while the student kind of went through the checklist, and then they worked through that together. So first, turn off the master switch, halting all that power. Any other switches that come from power, so lights, avionics, anything that is connected to that to keep that fire at bay. And so after that, let's see, you want to keep the fire from spreading. So basically, you're in the cabin, close all the vents. That's what they did. If there's heat, turn off that heat. You don't want anything to kind of be able to fuel that fire or get it in there, causing an even worse problem in the cabin of the plane. So he did that. While the instructor was flying the plane, the student was able to get the fire extinguisher and activate it to put out the fire as best as possible. So that is always good. So they put out the fire, and once that fire is out, the next step, which was on the checklist before, is to clear out the air in the cabin. So, there's smoke. Whenever you put out a fire, it puts up all that smoke that's taken the fire out, the fumes from the fire extinguisher. Everything needed to be clear so that they could keep seeing where they're going and keep on that VFR. So the student put out the fire, and then the next step was to reopen the vents so that the air could get through. So they did that. Fire's out. Opened all the vents, be able to breathe. So they were going to another airport on their way, and the next thing that they had to do, though, was just to check and see if that power is going. So if they're headed to that airport, they know that they're going to land there, show in the next slide, but they're going to land at this airport, and that's their best case scenario. So the emergency landing, they were close enough, thankfully, where they could get into that Ridgeland airport. So they tried all the power to see if anything was working, the avionics, the lights, and unfortunately the power still wasn't working, which meant that they weren't able to make radio calls to anybody. So it's not always something that would be good, but in this case, there was no control tower at Ridgeland Airport anyway. There was no way for them to really communicate with any of the other planes to let them know that they were doing an emergency landing. So, maybe they could have called like the police or the fire trucks or somebody else on land to let them know what they were doing. But that's not always, the priority. Aviate, navigate, communicate. So they're aviating and they're navigating. Didn't really communicate, but that's okay. If they had the opportunity, maybe calling somebody on the ground would have been a good idea. So landing the plane as soon as possible is really important, especially in a fire situation. And in this case, they were close to the airport, which made that obviously the best option. The instructor set them up to land, glide speed, best field airport, cockpit check. Everything was good. They put out that fire. So, again, no radio communication, so checking for traffic in the air is important to avoid an emergency. You're flying through, you're already dealing with a lot of stuff, and you don't want to forget about checking around you, especially at a non-towered airport without any communication, knowing if there's another plane coming right at you. So, let's see. They made a successful landing, pulled off the runway, which was a good idea. However, sometimes in fires, exiting the aircraft immediately would probably be a good idea. But, the fire was out. It was just an electrical fire, too. So they pulled off the runway, made sure nobody was going to hit them. And, that was a pretty good idea, I think. All right, so after they landed, as soon as they were off the runway, they got out of the plane, they headed away from it, which is always smart in case the plane decides to burst into flames, which is not going to be a good idea or a good scenario. So they get off, the plane is secured, and they successfully handled the emergency. They called the police and filed a report. So since they had an electrical malfunction in their situation, notifying the NTSB immediately is actually required. So in a lot of cases, it's always good to know when it's required or not, but this was a major malfunction and the power still wasn't working even after they put out the fire. So they do have to notify them. The emergency was handled, and the student and instructor and the plane all made it out safely, which is definitely what everyone wants to happen in these situations. Sometimes they can go bad, and especially if you're unprepared for these cases, it's always really good to know exactly, the procedure. Even though you have the checklist in there, even though you have everything else, This was just one case of an emergency. There's always different, and if they weren't in the vicinity of the airport, they probably would have had to make another decision, where to land, and then figure that out too and make sure it was a safe landing for them and a safe area for them to land in. So, but they handled it well, and they were able to step away from this emergency with the best case scenario. So, aviate, navigate, communicate, use the checklist, know your options, and hopefully this will not happen to any of us, but being prepared and knowing exactly what to do is always the best situation. So